welcome to Fearless DIY Music. My name is Tristan Lass, and today we're going to be covering making a nut for an electric guitar, but the procedures that I will go through, or in the order in which I will do them, applies equally to acoustic guitar nuts, any nut on any instrument that requires a nut. So anyway, we're going to be working with a Stratocaster style nut on the Tone Bomb neck that has been featured on the channel a number of times. So I need to get a nut made for this so that it's ready to go on the instrument that I want to put it on. Alright, so the first step is selecting the correct type of nut. Obviously I have this one. It is a blank. It fits nicely and perfectly into the slot here. So a lot of the work has already been done. However, if you were doing this for an acoustic guitar, a Les Paul style guitar, or any guitar that doesn't have the Fender style slot here with kind of a proprietary nut shape already provided when you buy the blank, you're going to have to do additional shaping to get it to fit properly. On this one it is pretty simple, but on other styles of nuts you have to do both height, width, and length. So to get it, down to the perfect size. You can do that with sandpaper, or like the little belt sander, like the little one I have over here that I'll be using to do the ends of this. And so anyway, let's assume that I've already shaped it, its width, and its height. And now we're going to go ahead and get the length of the nut properly done. So I'm going to put it in here, into the slot. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark, I want to have an equal amount of material on either side. Make my pencil mark here. And I'm going to remove that so that it is roughly the right length for the nut slot. So I'm going to head over to the sander here in a minute, go ahead and get this sized in. Then I'll do some fine sanding, fit it, make sure that it's right. And then we'll get on to the next part, which will be cutting the actual slots in the nut. Alright, be right back. Alright, so I've got those ends have been trimmed down using my little belt sander, and so I've got a close-up that I'll put over here showing how the nut looks. I left a little bit of overhang because when I do the final fit and finish of the nut, before I glue it in, I will want to be able to sand it just perfectly flush along with the wood material of the neck itself. Alright, so now that we have the dimensional fitment, i.e. the height is right, the length is right, and the width is right. Now that we're there, I'm going to go ahead and just set the nut into the slot, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to determine the string spacing. So this is one of those cases where you could just go to an instrument that you already have, or if you have an old nut that you're replacing, and you can just copy the string spacing off of something like that. However, since I'm lucky enough to have one of these rules right here, this is just a StewMac ruler that has an infinite variety of string spacings on it. So I have already matched this up to a Stratocaster style guitar to get the string spacing right. I know where my low E begins. I'll put a close-up of this up as well. And now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to mark where the string grooves are going to be, where the nut slots are going to be. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to make sure 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 if I have this right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I don't know if that is the right. Let's see here. Yes, that is correct. Alright, so now sometimes when you're staring at these little grooves in this rule, it's kind of a mind game in a way, and you start to question yourself for a second. However, I've got this lined up, and now what I want to do is I want the high E and the low E to be equidistant from the edges of the nut. So I am doing that right now so I can make my marks, because these marks are pretty critical. Because this is, where the strings are going to be. So now I'm just marking it very carefully, very lightly with some pencil. And that doesn't look like it lined up quite the way that I wanted it to. So I'm going to scoot it a little bit. We're going to go ahead and erase that. And that's the beauty of using like pencil and things like that. That just comes right off, and we're going to go ahead and give it a second go. Because we want to make sure to get this right. Because if it's not right, then we have to make another one. And we don't want to be making guitar nuts all day long. Which sometimes happens. I mean, actually, to be completely transparent in this video, this is perhaps my least favorite part of the guitar building process. I've built a number of instruments by hand, and I swear that the nut is the one thing I usually have to go back and redo at least once. I think that I have a pretty reasonably good idea of the spacing here. The spacing looks perfect to my eye right here. So now we're going to go ahead and cut the first nut slot, and what I do is I go ahead and I put the nut into my little vise here, and I've got, once again, sometimes there's just essential tools. I think that you can get by without the string spacing guide. You can just copy another nut. You can even just, go through and measure, measure in millimeters and get pretty close to the right spacing. I don't know if this is completely essential, but it does make things a lot easier. However, the fret slot cutting saws, these just make life so easy. They're huge. So anyway, now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start on my low E slot, and I'm going to cut at an angle, because you want to cut with your saw angle back towards the headstock like that, because your string break, you just want that to be a single point where the string hits, and then it heads towards the headstock. So you always want to saw in that direction. This is a pull saw, so it only cuts on the pull. And right now, I'm just going to get this going and check where we're at. That looks really good. Now, the other thing that I forgot to mention right up front, since this is a proprietary, nut blank basically, this is pretty easy. I don't have too much to worry about as far as how deep do I need to go. I don't need to go hardly any depth whatsoever, and I want to go really shallow to begin with so that I have room to adjust down. However, the rule of thumb is you would take your pencil and you'd put it at about the height of the frets and just draw a little line on there, and that tells you how deep your slot should be. However, never go all the way to that line. You want to have wiggle room and adjustment when you get to the fine-tuning phase. All right, for the time being, I'm going to go ahead and cut the rest of the nut slots, and we'll be right back. All right, we're back. I've got the nut slots are cut. I used, these saws that you just saw a second ago. And just to clarify, these are gauged. So, I've got a .10 or a .010, a .015, a .020, a .025, and a .030. I used the .030 for the E string, the .05 or .025 for the A string, the .020 would be for the D. Then I use the .015 for the G string, and then I do the B and the E with the .010. So anyway, they're gauged, so you just work your way up. Now, that sounds smaller than average string gauge. It's because when we finish this nut, we will be using sandpaper and or a file to get the nut slots nice and clean. So, since I do not have this installed on an instrument yet, and I don't know how the strings are going to break and how everything's going to look yet, this is as far as I'm going to go with this nut on camera. However, the final finishing would be, let's pretend like this is on a guitar. You would go ahead and string it up, take a look, make sure that the string spacing looks right, and then you would check for height at the first fret. You want the strings to ride just barely above the first fret, but not making contact with it. That determines your nut slot depth, and then you would file accordingly. If you need to make them a little bit shallower, you would go ahead and file them out at that point. using either, like sandpaper folded in half, like a really, fine grit, like 400 to 600 grit sandpaper, and you can clean out the nut slots that way. You can also use nut slot files, which exist. I just usually use sandpaper. So you get that string height right at the first fret, make sure that your spacing is good, and then you do your final shaping. Final shaping just means, you don't want it to be all squared off. You kind of, I like to go ahead and take a little material off of the back of the nut at around a 45-degree angle. Then I round everything in nicely so that it's nice and smooth. But that's the basics of making a guitar nut. It's really not that difficult. However, if you don't have the fret nut slot, they're not fret, the nut slot saws to do it, it makes it a lot more difficult. Highly advise if you're going to be making multiples of these, or if it's something you're doing a lot of. These saws are an investment, but they are totally worth it. All right, you take care. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit subscribe. And if you have any tips of your own, please share them in the comments section. Always love to hear it. And you take care, and we'll see you next time.